Welcome, everybody. I'm Tom Christensen. I wanted to thank Angie for the kind introduction, and I just want to say it's a tremendous honor for me to be here in this role. The Committee of 100 is such a fantastic organization, and I'm also glad to follow Ambassador Cui. When I was at the State Department, I had the great pleasure of working with this generation of Chinese diplomatic leaders, and they are fantastic. And there's really no stronger example of that generation than Ambassador Cui, so we're very lucky to have him here in the United States. I wanted to introduce the speakers today. We have two very good speakers, and their expertise is very timely given the issues in U.S. China relations. First, I'll introduce Admiral Dennis Blair. You have his bio, so I'm not going to run through all of his incredible accomplishments. But I'll say that, we have a phrase, soldier, scholar, statesman. When I hear that term, I think of people like Dennis Blair. Very few people in the country can live up to that standard. As Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Command, he commanded the largest combat command for the United States, and as such, he had to play a role not only as a military strategist, but also as a diplomat. And then as Director of National Intelligence, he fulfilled the statesman piece in full. He's been running the Institute of Defense Analysis in the past, and I've been at a lot of scholarly conferences with him, and I can say that he is a true scholar of international relations as well. So he fits the bill entirely, and there are very few Americans who do. James Lewis comes from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's an expert on the Internet and politics. Jim is an expert on cybersecurity. He's an expert on the impact of the Internet on domestic and international politics. He served in the State Department and the Senior Executive Service of the U.S. government. He has a lot of experience inside and outside of government. And when you think about the topics that we're facing in U.S. China relations and in East Asian international relations today, you think of maritime disputes and cybersecurity issues. So I think we have a great panel for the issues at hand. I'm going to turn it over to Admiral Blair, to Denny first, and then to Jim. And I think that we should have an excellent discussion, and the floor will be open to questions later. And I have my trusty book that will give me the questions that have been raised. Denny?
Okay. Thanks very much, Tom. Well, it's good to be here. Let me, I know the Committee of 100 is a practical group, so I'll just give you my bottom line up front. I agree with the ambassador that strategic trust does not exist between the United States and China right now. It's probably an unavoidable condition of the relationship given current conditions. And I think that our challenge right now is simply to manage it and then to gradually reduce it over time. So I will describe a few aspects of this mutual distrust that I have observed, and then I think more important, I'd like to talk about what we can do to reduce it and to eventually eliminate it. Now, on the Chinese side, the source of strategic mistrust is pretty straightforward. In the preparatory materials that were distributed for this conference, the recent monograph by Ken Lieberthal and Wang Zhizi was mentioned, and as Zhizi wrote in that report last year, it is strongly believed in China that the ultimate goal of the United States in world affairs is to maintain its hegemony and dominance, and as a result, Washington will attempt to prevent the emerging powers, in particular China, from achieving their goals and enhancing their stature. Given that fundamental conviction, it's natural that the Chinese place American actions in a bad light. If the United States appears to be making a concession to China, it's only a tactical ploy in order to set the stage for a more aggressive move later, or else it was forced by American weakness. If the United States voices a concern for Chinese behavior based on fundamental values of liberty, democracy, and human rights, it's a cynical attempt to undermine China. If the United States supports an ally in Asia, It is to encourage that ally to challenge Chinese power and influence in order to check it. On the American side, I think that the situation is somewhat more complicated, but I see two underlying causes for China. The first is quite simple: China's authoritarian system of government. Americans at their core simply do not trust a country that has a repressive government. The second is a more sophisticated concern, and it is held by those who know Americans quite well. We believe that China's actions are more governed by power relationships than they are by a commitment to general rules which all nations should follow. As China's economic and military power grow, we see China's aggressiveness in support of its interests growing also. We don't know if there are limits on China's ambitions, or will they simply grow as far as its power takes it. With these underlying beliefs, Americans often interpret routine Chinese actions overseas as probes to spread its influence, the string of pearls theory that made sinister what were in fact relatively routine Chinese commercial shipping activities in the Indian Ocean. Chinese energy and mineral resource projects are interpreted as gambits to gain political power, along with insensitivity or contempt for liberty, democracy, and human rights. American security officials interpret Chinese actions as motivated by power relationships rather than adherence to general norms of behavior. We all have dozens of anecdotes to illustrate how these beliefs play out, and I will give a couple. I remember a conversation several years back with the head of the North American department of the Central Communist Party School in Beijing. He had just completed a 2-month stay in the United States, gathering information about American attitudes and policy towards China. He told me that he now really understood the American commitment to containing China, and he gave me a list of dozens of articles and books by Americans that he had discovered during his stay in the country that reinforced this point. On his entire list, I had heard of one of these American experts on China, and the other names were entirely unknown to me, and I follow the field pretty closely. That one that I did recognize was way out on the fringe of American opinion on China. When I protested that this group was not influential in this country, did not represent the thinking of most Americans, and certainly was not official policy, my interlocutor was not convinced. He had found what he was looking for. And remember, he headed the department that was teaching courses to all up-and-coming Chinese officials about what the United States was up to. One of the most sophisticated Chinese military officials I know, with whom I've had many frank and valuable conversations over many years, told me recently that I should simply stop worrying about China's military buildup. It was entirely for defensive purposes, and so did not pose any threat to the United States. He was sincere and simply could not understand my concern that increased Chinese military power might ever be brought to bear in support of Chinese interests and against American interests in a regional crisis. Now, there are interactive effects also which feed distrust on both sides. Neither side understands nor gives much credence to the importance of the domestic considerations in the other's policy, considerations that had nothing to do with grand national security, and neither side believes in Murphy's Law. I don't know if there's a Chinese Murphy, but he certainly is an Irish American. Therefore, most, I would say, Chinese firmly believe that the United States bombed their embassy in Belgrade on purpose. And most Americans believe that the Chinese probably put a Chinese fishing captain up to ramming a Japanese coastal patrol boat in the vicinity of the Diaoyus. And this mutual distrust forms a spiral. The more the Chinese believe the United States is trying to contain its growth, the more it pushes to expand its influence, giving greater credence to American convictions that China aims to displace American influence, inspiring American actions to protect its interests, and so forth up. Now, the conversations in which the strategic distrust edge is the sharpest are in the political military regime. By way of contrast, the relationships in economic and business areas are far more positive and win-win, and I'm encouraged by the degree of trust that exists between financial, business, and economic counterparts in China and the United States. As we all know, there are points of friction and mistrust. Americans mistrust the Chinese policies of indigenous innovation, rampant industrial espionage, and protection of their own markets. Chinese distrust what they see as predatory and exploitative actions by American business, U.S. government policies pressuring China on its exchange rate, and restrictions on Chinese investment in the United States. However, thousands of individual businesses, large and small, do business with each other to their mutual benefit in China and in the United States. Contracts are negotiated, signed, carried out, fulfilling their provisions, and each side expects the other to do so. So I think there's a sharp contrast between a fundamental basis of trust, that is, the other side will do what it says on the business side, and in the military security area, in which there are these deep distrusts of ultimate motivations. But I'd like to spend more of my time not lamenting this lack of strategic trust between China and the United States, but putting out a few ideas on what we can do about it. As I said, mistrust is not going to go away soon. We simply must manage it for a time. We must have all of these meetings that the ambassador mentioned in his talks, and it will probably be a long time before the mistrust is substantially reduced or eliminated. However, there are things that we can do. The first thing that we must do is call out the crazies. Those of us who believe that China and the United States are not fated to fight one another must not allow the fringe to dominate the discussion of Sino-American relations. If we allow Chinese commentators unreasonably suspicious of the United States, citing American commentators unreasonably suspicious of China, citing Chinese commentators as unreasonably suspicious of the United States, and so on, that cycle of mutual distrust will be established, and it will actually have public and political effects on the policies of both countries. They're not just words. They will have effects. Chinese and Americans who know better must say so publicly in their own countries, particularly in their own countries, that some extreme view is an extreme view, that it's incorrect, that it's not representative of most opinion, and they must continually pass that information on to their counterparts in the other country to reassure those in the other country that most of their countrymen do not share these paranoid views, that they don't represent official policy. The second thing we must do is judge one another by deeds, not so much by words. I'm continually struck in very closed and expert dialogues between Chinese and American officials that each side is completely convinced that its own overall approach is defensive, moderate, and righteous. Whether it's China conducting an anti-satellite test and building aircraft carriers, or the United States shifting almost two-thirds of its Navy to the Pacific, each side wants to reassure the other not to worry because our hearts are pure. And unsurprisingly, these reassurances are of little comfort to the other side, and in fact, they often fuel suspicion because they seem to be either naive or deceitful. I have found in my conversations with Chinese that I make much more progress if I'm honest and direct. When I was the Pacific commander, for example, I would tell the Chinese exactly what I thought the results would be of any military clash between our forces. I would acknowledge that the United States would take casualties, the Chinese forces would take worse casualties, and then what would be accomplished at the end of the fighting. And I found that these conversations were useful on both sides. When I was Director of National Intelligence, I would say, of course we spy on China, and of course China spies on the United States. Let's get over that and talk about what we're attempting to accomplish, what the understanding should be, and and how we can make sure that these don't result in unintended consequences. So this kind of discussion, based on facts and careful estimates rather than exaggeration, bluffing, or outright deceit, I believe will counteract strategic distrust over time. Especially in the military sphere, however, this recommendation is easier for the United States to adopt than it is for China. I've had Chinese counterparts explain to me that the skinny cat has to turn sideways. In other words, that the weaker side must make itself appear to be larger and more powerful than it actually is. If that was true in the past for China, it is certainly less true with every passing year as Chinese economic and military power grows, and I think it's time for the Chinese cat to face these things head on. The same sort of directness should be characteristic of our mutual exchanges on all subjects: North Korea, Iran, the South China Sea, the Diaoyu Senkakus, nuclear proliferation, cybersecurity. We will get nowhere by mutual recitals of the beauty of our own positions. We can only make progress by fact-based discussion and selection of alternatives. And the third thing we must do, and this will take a long time, is to establish and demonstrate a commitment to honoring common understandings of our mutual limits. Demonstrate a commitment to honoring common understandings of our mutual limits. The United States must demonstrate, not just preach, to China by deeds that it acknowledges China's right to play a more influential role in the world economically, financially, militarily, diplomatically. It must demonstrate that it is prepared to share with China the responsibility for setting and enforcing international rules and customs and enjoying the benefits of those rules and customs. China, for its part, must demonstrate to the United States by deeds that it is willing to abide by international rules or customs itself, even when these customs and rules set limits on its ambitions and on its power. The process for China joining and subsequently abiding by the restrictions of the WTO, I think, offer a good example of this virtuous cycle. Although some Chinese actions since it joined have created concern in the United States that China is attempting more to enjoy the benefits than to assume the obligations, in general, the WTO process has built trust in China on the American side. Some in China remain suspicious that American companies want to take advantage of the WTO rules and procedures to strangle competing Chinese companies at birth, but overall I think China believes that it has benefited by the process. In the diplomatic and security area, though, results have been more mixed. China has become in recent years a responsible member of the nuclear nonproliferation community and is recognized as such. While many in the United States believe that China could do more to put pressure on Iran and North Korea to restrain their nuclear ambitions, no responsible American believes that China secretly favors a nuclear Iran or North Korea as being in its own interests in order to weaken the United States. Peacekeeping operations are developing. China deploys a respectable number of peacekeepers, but they're in very small numbers. It would be a major breakthrough if China and the United States both were to contribute major units to a serious Chapter 7 peacekeeping operation. Potential scenarios could include UN intervention to prevent famine or mass killings, or to preserve maritime security against coastal nations' threats or attacks. But let me finish with a final cautionary observation. Right now, most Americans believe that China is motivated to pursue a relatively benign approach to its international relations by the priority that it gives to domestic and social development. Chinese official statements that it needs a peaceful international environment are reassuring in the short term. But does that mean that once the Chinese interior achieves the level of prosperity of the rest of China, the East Coast, the restraints are off? China needs to assure the rest of the world that not only that it needs a benign international environment right now, but that it desires a benign international environment in future, and that it's willing to work for one. Right now, most Chinese believe that the United States is restrained in its pursuit of global hegemony by its slowing economic growth and its political stasis. If China resumes robust economic growth based on, for example, the newly found energy bonanza, both natural gas and oil, and it recovers from the 2008 housing bubble, and if politics in the United States become more positive, which most Americans want it to become and will eventually succeed, does that mean that the United States will resume a move towards hyperpower status? The United States needs to assure China that it has no desire to put greater pressure on China if its economy improves and its politics improve. Developments like this would send us into a new round of strategic distrust, competition, and potentially conflict. And it's important for all of us who believe in the importance of a good U.S. China relationship to manage the competitive aspects and continue to work for more permanent bases of at least limited trust and eventually more complete trust. Thank you.
Jim Lewis is next, and please.
Great. I wondered if we were the Hawk panel. And, you know, in diplomatic terms, when you tell people you're going to have a frank discussion, that usually means they should put on their life jackets. So, but I'm going to be frank. This is what I would say. I'm going to be frank in part because I like China, and I think ultimately we will have a partnership of some kind. The joke I usually use in China is that China and America will get along ultimately because we have a common religion, and that is that we both worship money. And there's a little truth to that, right? This is funny for me, and so I appreciate the offer, and I appreciate being here with two distinguished panelists. It occurred to me as I was thinking about this, I started negotiating with the Chinese in 1992 on different topics, and I've been in 5 different negotiations with them, all of them involving security issues. The one that probably people hate the most is I was the person who came and said, you know, there's this stuff, encryption and the internet, and, you know, maybe you should set up an office to... So that was me. That was our policy at the time, what can I say? And so in that perspective, is building trust a reasonable goal for policy? And in some ways it's a little nebulous, so I think some of what we want to do is focus in. And I'm going to talk a lot about China, less about the United States. The first thing to note is that we're talking about governments. We're not talking about countries or peoples or societies. This is relations between two governments. How do we improve them, right? One of the things I've seen in many talks with the Chinese is that they often live in what I would call a pink bubble, right? Because they are in an environment where the news is restricted. And so they have this very positive image. That's good. I was talking to a PLA Major General who said, we can't cooperate with you in Pakistan because in the Middle East, everyone loves China and hates the U.S. Well, I said that was really cool, but I didn't understand how that worked if you were partners with Iran. Tell me how that worked in the Persian Gulf. And they, of course, got annoyed at that. But there is this kind of, you know, if you're reading People's Daily and Xinhua all the time, you're going to get a different view of the world. And they don't have that degree of understanding that you'd find in other places. The story China tells itself will have to change for there to be trust. So the story, the official story is, you know, victims, plots, century of humiliation, U.S. hegemony. Progress began in 1949. Just like other countries, you have to take a step back and look at your history, the good parts and the bad parts. It's been very painful for us. We're still not through that, but you have to start doing that. One of the things I think about as an example of that is I got to meet with a State Council Information Office vice minister who was very annoyed that the Swedes had given a Chinese dissident the Nobel Prize. And I said, well, you know, now that you're a great power, you just have to get used to that. I mean, one year they give it to someone who doesn't like us, the next year they give it to someone, you know, just, it's part of the deal. And they said, no, it was a Western plot. It was a Western plot. I said, well, have you ever worked with the Swedes? They're very stubborn. You know, it's just not, but this belief that somehow we're behind this massive plan to contain China is prevalent, and it needs to come away. It's hard to build trust, however, when the Chinese don't trust themselves, right? And so one of the things that you would want to say is that the opening to the past of China and the recognition of that history did not begin in 1949 will be an important part for the two countries to be able to work together, right? There is a little bit of tone deafness in Chinese policy, and you see this with their neighbors, with Japan, with Korea, with Burma, with Vietnam. And some of that is the result of Maoism, some of that is the result of the political situation. But the question I would ask in building strategic trust is, does China have to trust itself first to be able to trust the United States? I think that's an element of this problem. China sees our relationship as a zero-sum game, and so we get to be political scientists for minutes. Zero-sum means for me to win, you have to lose, right? And one of the things that you learn, you know, as a negotiator is to listen to the other side. And there's this idea of something called projection, which is what they're saying reflects what they're really thinking, even though the words may not point that way. So the Chinese are always telling me, and I'm negotiating with them now on norms for cyberspace and conflict. The Chinese are always telling me we have to move to a win-win situation. What does that say? That means they think we're not in a win-win situation, we're in a zero-sum situation. And so an important part for building trust, and you heard this from the Admiral, is getting people to revise their thinking. It's not a zero-sum game. We can benefit from partnership. We've seen this over and over again. An important part of this is ending misperception and the risk of miscalculation. There's misperception on both sides. It's something that you can work with people, you can talk about them. We've had 7 what are called Track 1.5 meetings with the Chinese on cybersecurity. The last one was attended by 50 Chinese officials. They were relatively frank. It was a frank discussion, as we say in diplomacy, right? But there's been some really interesting things that have come out. In one of the sessions, the Chinese head said, we know why you Americans are so interested in cybersecurity, and we look at something called, there's an exercise every year that the Department of Homeland Security holds called Cyberstorm. They said, Cyberstorm is like missile defense. And we were kind of baffled. It's like, huh? And they said, yes, it's missile defense because missile defense is something you're building to cancel out China's strategic deterrent. And you're doing cybersecurity so that you will have impunity to strike China in cyberspace. Those are quotes, right? And we didn't know what to say. I mean, so we tried to persuade them, look, it's DHS, come on. And I learned that, for example, the post office must have worked in China, because I actually said, come on, DHS is like the post office. And that didn't go over. But that level of mistrust, I mean, if you've ever been to a wonderful agency, but not exactly what you'd call a strategic deterrent out there in Roslyn, in Arlington, how do you get them to think about it? At another one of these meetings, they said, you've been talking a lot about signaling. How do you signal intentions? And Foreign Affairs is a very prestigious journal in the U.S. There was an article in Foreign Affairs that said that U.S. companies should be allowed to strike China back when they engage in cyber espionage. Was that a signal? And it was hard to explain to them that there is this debate. There's a debate in the U.S. Things that get published in Foreign Affairs are not controlled by Washington. Whereas in China, for something to be published in one of the most prestigious, maybe the second most prestigious journal, would definitely require some sort of governmental chop, right? We are not in a Cold War with China. There can not be a Cold War. There cannot be détente. It's not the kind of world anymore. It's not bipolar. People are not going to do that. But we're also not in a framework of serious negotiations with the Chinese. And we had ongoing negotiations with the Soviets on security issues that greatly built trust over time, over about 15 years. We do not have those. Meeting with people and having talks, that's cute. I think it's wonderful. A negotiation is where you come in the room and say, I want something from you. I want a commitment, and here's what I'm willing to give up. We do not do that enough with China, right? We are at a unique moment, or another unique moment, I guess, in international affairs, and you have 3 trends that complicate this problem. 3 powerful trends that are intersecting and produce forces that are hard to gauge. First, we're moving from a transatlantic world to a global world, right? 20 years ago, it was a lot easier to be a negotiator because if the Europeans, the Japanese, and the Americans agreed on something, we could announce this was now a global norm. Everyone should do it. And we could go to Beijing on missile proliferation, for example, and say, look, it's a global norm. You didn't participate, it's true, but everyone does this. We can't do that anymore. And it's not just China. You hear this from the Brazilians and the Indians. We didn't come up with this agreement. Why should we sign it? So how do we deal with a world where Europe is much weaker, where the transatlantic relationship that dominated the globe for a century is over, and where we have to deal with these new powers? The other one, and the Admiral touched on a lot, is China's return to international power. We all know that story, and having watched the Chinese try and figure out how to deal with the fact they're not a small developing country anymore. They're the world's second largest economy, and there's different responsibilities as a result. Right? This is going to be very hard. The third trend, though, and it's a little more complicated, but I think it directly affects strategic trust, is that you want to look at Chinese history as a continuum, right? And history did not begin in 1949. There are political reasons why you have to say that, but if you go back, it's been 150 years of change and reform in China. And it's really an amazing story when you look at what the Chinese reformers of the 1850s and the 1860s wanted. You know, they wanted sort of Western technology with Chinese characteristics. I read that. I don't know if that was the right translation. But there's a continuum here that we're seeing in the reform in China of the society, of politics, of the economy, is proceeding, and it's proceeding in a somewhat uneven fashion. So I think those internal tensions do more to shape trust between the two countries than anything else, and it's something we need to think about. We've already had 2 partnerships with China. Guess what? They're both over. The first partnership was an anti-Soviet alliance. It was not a formal alliance, but there was an understanding that we would transfer arms and military technology to China that they could use against the Soviets, and we began doing that. That alliance ended with Tiananmen Square. After that, we built an economic alliance, an economic partnership, right, that has been one of the great engines of global growth. It's tremendous to see the growth in China. What we tend to forget sometimes is that's produced tremendous growth in the United States as well, right? And so this economic partnership has been tremendous, but it's also now ending, right? And that's a hard thing for people to think about. It's ending because of China's trade behavior. If Charles can tell you later, it'll be interesting to see what the trade panel says about non-tariff barriers to trade. Concerns about China's behavior, and particularly its massive espionage campaign, industrial and economic espionage, largely conducted through cyberspace. These things build distrust, right? You cannot... believe it or not, there are implicit rules for espionage, right? You don't talk about them, but there are implicit rules.
You do talk about them sometimes.
You talk about them in private with your counterparts. You know, we're going to talk about them now a little bit. China has gone beyond the limits. We're not the only country that thinks that, right? It's not just Western countries that think that. How do you get them to reel it back in? But until they do, there will be distrust, right? So I'm not sure what the basis for a third partnership will be. It's not military. It's not economics. We have to figure this out. A good first step would be sustained engagement at senior levels that goes beyond simple meet and greet, that goes to direct discussions of we want something, here's what we're prepared to give. If you're going to do this, you have to do it on a monthly basis, right? And I don't see the same level of commitment that we saw on the American side, that we saw in the Cold War. This has to change. You need to identify where the rules that exist now for how countries interact with each other need to change to accommodate China's rise to power. But part of that has to be a commitment from China that they will abide by the rules. This is the real source of instability in the international system. And so cybersecurity, lots of fun, you know, interesting. The real problem is it's not death by 1,000 cuts. It's not the end of the American economy. It's not electronic Pearl Harbors or a cyber Cold War. What it is the tremendous source of instability in the international system, right? And China is the primary cause of that. We need to find a way to restore stability, and that will mean understanding how China will fit in, right? We need to continue the path, or we need to see continued progress on the path to reform that China began more than 100 years ago. When you read the Chinese reformers of the 1900s or the late 19th century, you can see continuity. And in some ways I was thinking about it and preparing for this. They would be really happy because some of their goals have been achieved. Think of where China was in, say, 1840 and think of where it is now. China has succeeded in meeting some of these long-term goals that have been identified by its reformers. They haven't succeeded in others, and this will be an important problem. What we can do in the near term, though, is we can work on misperception, and you've heard this over and over again. We were saying to the ambassador when he left the stage that a good way to get a laugh out of Americans is to tell them they have a grand strategy, right? We don't have a grand strategy, right? We may have interests, but the interests are not in remaining the hegemon, right? I don't think that's a good way to describe U.S. policy. So how do we reduce misperception? How do we work with China? China's success is in our interest, but it has to be a success that fits the pattern of international relations. Ultimately, I'm confident that we can get there, but it's going to be a period of unease for a number of years. And we'll just have to think of reducing tension so they don't escalate into conflict, reducing misperception, and building the understandings that will let us eventually turn this into a more stable relationship.
Thanks very much, Jim. Thanks, Denny. I wanted to make a couple of comments and then start the question and answer period. And my main comment is that we have two deficits in U.S. China relations as I see it. I had the privilege of working in the State Department in the period just after Deputy Secretary Zellick made his famous speech calling on China to be a responsible stakeholder at the National Committee meeting in New York. And the spirit of that was to urge China to play a larger role on the international stage, to try to undercut that strategic mistrust that was based on the notion that the United States was trying to keep China down. It was an open invitation for China to play a larger role. But more concretely, it was an invitation to find areas outside of the bilateral relationship where we could actually get things done together and prove to each other that we have so many common interests. I think any objective observer who is not using some preconceived theoretical lens would say the United States and China have a tremendous number of common interests. It's hard sometimes to address those common interests by starting with dialogues about nuclear crisis management in the bilateral relationship. Those things are important to have. They're extremely important to have. But that's probably not where trust is going to be built in a constructive and gradual fashion. That's for specific contingencies that you hope don't happen, but if they do, it's better to be prepared in advance for handling them. And I think areas like Sudan, Darfur, where 2006, 2007, we improved cooperation. North Korea in that period, 06 to 07, we improved cooperation for a while. Sometimes it's better than other times. And then the Gulf of Aden operations, where we fight pirates together off the coast of Somalia. Those types of operations, I think, help everybody involved in the endeavor of improving U.S.-China relations to demonstrate concretely that we have common interests. And I would hope that we could do more of that. And sometimes I hear a discouraging note from my Chinese friends who say, first we need to define the nature of the relationship, and then we can build these constructive partnerships. But I think maybe in this case the American approach is more realistic, which is let's do the cooperation, and on that basis we can build a better sense of mutual trust. Because it's easier to do those types of cooperation in areas that are farther away from the bilateral relationship where so many sensitive issues are touched upon almost immediately. And those are my only comments. And I have a pad here with questions on it, and I understand that we have a student, a graduate student at the Hopkins Nanjing Center who would like to ask a question. Am I to read the question, or is he actually going to raise... He's going to raise the question. Oh, he's going to be up there. Okay. This is Liu Chang from the Hopkins Nanjing University Center.
Let's do the cooperation. On that basis, we can build a better sense of mutual trust. Because it's easier to do this type of cooperation. Areas are farther away from do that.
Maybe you need to read the question.
Yeah.
Should I read it? Okay, I will read the question.
You could sign it.
The question is, it is a commonly held...
I understand that you have a student, a graduate student at the Hopkins Nanjing.
Okay, maybe I should just read it?
Yep.
Okay, I'll read the question. Maybe we should shut that down. It is a commonly held view that the most serious challenge for U.S.-China relations is the lack of mutual strategic trust. In your experience, what have been some ways in which you have worked to establish mutual trust between the two countries? Are there new ways we can consider to establish even greater trust? I gather that's for both panelists.
I mean, that's what we talked about in our remarks, clearly. But strategic trust is basically confidence that the other person will take an action even though it doesn't, even though it isn't in the short-term best interest of that party, but it's reaching a long-term state that you both agreed on. It's that idea that you don't have to watch every single step of the way, that you don't have to weigh up the relationship, gram by gram, each step along the way. And I think that your remarks get to the heart of it, Tom, that the way to do that is to choose issues in which your interests run clearly parallel, form some general understandings, and then let each side work a bit, and then realize over time that, yes, you've both done what you said you would do, you're moving in the right right direction. Let's try some more of this. That I think is the one. I think the attempt to sort of create some overall huge strategic understanding that will then drive cooperation and trust in a number of individual areas is simply too hard right now. And although we make attempts to do that, we make grand declarations that both China and the United States want a peaceful world, and we both therefore will do things that aid that goal. I think is just a step too far, because there are too many individual issues in which our interests, in fact, run on different sides, and in which we haven't learned the habit of compromise yet. So, to me, the way forward is to maintain the overall commitment to minimizing the chances of crisis and conflict, working on individual issues, and then letting the understanding reach the action level that, in fact, there is a future in which both China and the United States can play very large and important roles that does not involve spending all their time worrying about who's number one and who's number two, but what's good for both of them. So I tend to favor the practical approach that you described.
We're dealing with different negotiating styles, too. I mean, one of the things that's come up is that very often with Chinese negotiators, they start out by saying we should agree on principles. And the Americans are always saying, no, let's move directly to some problem. I'm not a big fan of the term strategic trust. I mean, in the Cold War, you had this idea of strategic stability, and we tend to try and resuscitate various Cold War ideas, maybe by giving them a new coat of paint. So strategic trust, let's talk about reducing suspicion, and let's talk about identifying specific areas where we can work together. And I would disagree a little bit with Tom, is that yes, there are places where there are successes, but we also need to tackle the hard issues and directly on. And that might be done privately and it might be done quietly, but we've got to do both at the same time. If we are indeed partners and we are trusting ourselves, we can pretend we trust each other. Then we can talk about the hard things as well as cooperate in places where our interests overlap.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I didn't mean to imply that we don't have to deal with the hard issues. The question is, you manage what is certainly going to be competition between the United States and China. One of the things I appreciated about this panel is how realistic it was. It would be easy to come up here and say our countries have common interests, the benefits of cooperation and far outstrip competition, and therefore competition should just go away. Well, competition is not going to go away. We're going to have a competitive security relationship. To some degree, we'll have a competitive economic relationship. And then the question is, how do you keep that competitive aspect of the relationship from taking over everything and having it trump everything else? And one of the ways, as Jim says, you have to manage those directly important issues that touch upon national security. You've got to wrestle with them. But at the same time, I think if you're talking about trust, and that is the topic of the panel, you have to build examples, concrete examples, of how you have common interests and how you share certain values and preferences around the world in a way that doesn't pose a zero-sum problem, as you put it. Here's another question.
One other point on that, Tom. You know, one of the interesting things is the attempt to build strategic trust and cooperation between China and the United States without a common enemy deprives us of one of the techniques that has traditionally driven countries together. Chinese and Americans often talk about the days of World War II when we had this common enemy, Japan, and so on. Or, as Jim mentioned, at one point the basis of our partnership was common opposition to the Soviet Union. So, in a way, you can say, "Darn, we just need a common enemy to and then we could work together." But when you really think about it, we are trying to do something unprecedented. Two countries which are very powerful have come out of very, very different traditions, not united by a common enemy, are trying to sort of work out how they can both succeed. And it's tough. It's hard to think of many historical examples which
And at the same time, be careful what you wish for. Common enemies are very painful.
Exactly.
Japanese imperialism was painful to everybody.
Yes, right,
And
right.
the Soviet Union, I'm personally grateful that it's gone. So.
Yes, amen.
Okay, here's another question. This is for Admiral Blair and for me. I didn't realize I was a target for questions. It's from the Hopkins Nanjing Center, a graduate student named William Yale. The question is there any possibility that the United States and China will ever conduct joint planning and for a potential crisis on the Korean Peninsula, i.e. especially between DoD and the PLA? Uncertainty over each side's strategic intent in such an outcome seems to be a major stumbling block, especially since for China the issue is so sensitive. Yeah. So since this is a really sensitive question, I'm going to turn it over to you first, Danny, since it's...
I think the answer is yes, we will conduct planning. The question is, will we do it in the desperate last days of when a crisis occurs, or will we, or is there any chance of doing it ahead of time? And many of us have tried to talk to the Chinese about planning. I mean, we all have this terrible historical example in which American-led forces moved up to the Yalu River, completely missing Chinese pretty strong signals that if we did so, they would enter the war, and then we actually had Americans killing Chinese. And if there were military operations in the Korean Peninsula, again, without better understanding between the two sides as to what their ultimate goals were and who was doing what, it could lead to real danger of escalation. So I think that if a crisis happened, there would be desperate consultation and planning at the last minute. I would favor trying to push that back earlier without making commitments on either side. I mean, not that we would be plotting against North Korea, but just talking about what ifs. So far, that has not taken. That sort of consultation has not taken place.
Yeah, I think it's very important for us to talk in advance, because the implications of not doing that are rather dire. If there were, let's say, a North Korean collapse, a precipitous collapse of government capacity, there are a lot of reasons for actors to want to go into North Korea and make sure that bad things don't happen, like nuclear proliferation. It'd be much better to talk about in advance, and I think one of the problems is that it's hard for Americans to convey that when we talk about hypothetical situations like a collapse, we're talking about them as events that might occur outside of any U.S. actions previous that might have brought them about. In other words, these are accidents of history that could occur. We need to be prepared in advance for them. And I think when we talk about them, many people in China think that's because you're plotting to undermine the state of North Korea in some active, kinetic way, and then you want us to plan for the results of your destabilizing behavior. And I think that is a misperception that we might be able to correct over time. And I think there are other issues that are sensitive as well from the American point of view, is that if the Chinese were to talk to us about these things, it would probably have to happen in very small groups, very sensitive, very classified type of discussions. And unfortunately, in this country, we don't have a great record of holding such things tightly to our chests and not letting the press know about them, et cetera. So we have a problem, I think, within the U.S. government structure of keeping confidential conversations confidential. So those types of conversations would have to stay confidential, because I don't think the Chinese want to convey to their North Korean neighbors that they're discussing such matters. Okay, I have 3 minutes, so I will ask another question from a student at the University of Bern. I can't open the question. Oh, here it is. It seems that neither dispute resolution mechanism of the UNCLOS nor talks between ASEAN and China can solve the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. And my pad is acting up, so I cannot read the question. I apologize. Okay, back in. Do you see room and acceptance for U.S. mediation or cooperation between China and the other littoral states to solve these disputes? This is from Patrick Renz and Frauke Heidemann at the University of Bern. It's pretty exciting to have these questions coming from all over the world.
One thing to bear in mind is that the U.S. has been a Pacific presence really from the start of the Republic. And sometimes I think it's difficult for people to realize that. One way to irritate Europeans, since these are European questioners, is I always tell them America is a Pacific nation, that we have a coastline. We are part of the Trans-Pacific region, right? And that's not going to change. And that means we have a role in these disputes, particularly given our historic presence, our historic function as someone who helped provide stability. So what that role will be is unclear. And one of the things that we've all talked about for decades is that the Asian region doesn't have this kind of robust dialogue, the robust institutions for dealing with security problems. That's changed in recent years with the ASEAN Regional Forum, with some of the other activities. But the points are, we probably need to find a good way to engage multilaterally on this, not quite there yet, but the U.S. inevitably will have a role. We are in the Pacific. We've been there since the very first country the U.S. had relationships with was Thailand, right, other than France, after France. So we're there. We'll be part of it.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Admiral Blair, about mediation, U.S. mediation? That was in the question. Those words stuck out to me.
Right, right. I mean, it's very difficult in these South China Sea territorial and maritime rights disputes to have a policy that can't be caricatured as we're for Philippines against the United States, for Vietnam against China. I mean, it's hard to stand on what I think our position should be, that disputes like this should be either they should be negotiated according to some set of principles. They shouldn't simply be based on a sort of a bilateral power relationship. That they should be done peacefully, and that means not only do you not go invade some island that you think you have a claim to, but you don't take these quasi-military actions of going out and patrolling around it, buzzing with airplanes, doing all of the near war movements, but that you sit down and sort it out at the bargaining table. And I think the United States should not provide a room and refreshments and call people in and mediate in terms of getting between the two. I don't think we need to be a guarantor of some agreement, but I think we should be quite firm on the way that the countries themselves should work them out, and the things that we will would involve our interests if they're not followed, and those would primarily be use of force, I believe, and unilateral assertion of a right without the diplomatic negotiated aspects of it.
Well, thanks very much. I think our time is up, and I wanted to thank the organizers again for this fantastic conference, and thank Mercy Guo for inviting me initially. Thank you very much. And I wanted to thank our terrific panelists, Denny Blair and Jim Lewis, for their comments, and to the questioners from around the world who contributed their questions. So thanks very much.
I want to thank all of the esteemed speakers again for the roundtable, and a big applause for the robust discussion we've just had. And now I'd like to call on a number of the Committee 100 representatives to join us on stage when we bring out the House Majority Leader Eric Cantor. First, we have Chairman Dominic Ng and Mr. Richard Chang.
It is my greatest honor and privilege to have this opportunity to introduce our next speaker, who does not really need any introduction. Mr. Eric Cantor the majority leader of our current Congress, has a long list of achievements both in the state of Virginia and the Capitol. I do not have a lot of time to read the long list, but I do want to highlight in 2012, Majority Leader Cantor's leadership and vision were critical to the congressional bipartisan passage of House Resolution 683, which was proposed by Representative Judy Chu of California, an expression of regret for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The Committee of 100 respects and appreciates Mr. Cantor's commitment to the passage of this resolution. Now, I'm proud to present my fellow Virginian, the Honorable Eric Cantor, Majority Leader, U.S. House of Representatives.
Good morning. Thank you, Richard, for that nice welcome. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today. One of America's greatest strengths has always been the diversity of its people, and the contributions to our nation's advancement by Chinese Americans has been invaluable. From the many successful achievements in business, academia, and medicine, Chinese Americans have been vital to our nation's success. Since this country's founding, America has continually been a work in progress. We've not always gotten things right, and from the beginning, we've had some flaws and made some mistakes. But an important step when growing is having the ability to look back, to recognize, and learn from those mistakes. In our history, some of our darkest times have come from the way we've treated the newest Americans. As you know all too well, many of those moments came with legislation passed by Congress to specifically target and punish Chinese immigrants. Knowing this history, I was proud to stand with you last June and support a resolution in Congress expressing regret for the Chinese Exclusion Act. In so many countries around the world, children are often consigned to live the same life their parents had, but not here. In America, hope and opportunity for a better future can exist for all. Like many of you, my family, in fact my grandparents, came to America to seek a better life. In their case, they fled the violent anti-Semitic pogroms of the czars of Russia to come here to the United States. Widowed at a young age, my grandmother raised my father and uncle in a tiny apartment atop a grocery store that she and my grandfather had opened once they arrived in my hometown of Richmond. With little more than faith, thrift, and a belief in the American dream, my grandmother worked 7 days a week to ensure that her two sons could realize the promise and hope of this great country. It was very difficult at times, but her hope remained strong and her belief in America never wavered. Today, my family stands as proof of the possibility to what once may have truly been an impossible dream to my grandmother. Those of us privileged enough to serve in public office have a responsibility to ensure that America remains a land of opportunity for everyone. The American dream should not be a reachable goal for only a select few, but for all who seek to attain it. Recently, I was introduced to a young lady named Fiona Zhu. Now, Fiona is currently earning her master's degree at George Washington University School of Engineering and Applied Science. Originally from China, Fiona has been in the U.S. for 5 years, studying operations research in the Systems Engineering Department. Fiona told me she'd like to stay here after she graduates and invest her talents in America. She may even like to start her own company. But sadly, Fiona has seen many of her friends with advanced degrees return to their home countries instead of being able to stay here to pursue their dreams. And she's worried that she may suffer the same fate. This is the result of our not having enough visa slots in our immigration system that would permit students like Fiona to stay. The fact is, each year our colleges and universities graduate approximately 40,000 foreign nationals with master's and PhD degrees, and many are forced to leave this country. As a result, these students go and earn their success somewhere else instead of inventing, creating, and starting their own business here in America. This has got to stop, and we in the House of Representatives have the right solution. Last year, we passed the bipartisan STEM Jobs Act, and we'll act on this issue again and hope that this time the Senate can join us. With this resolution, Fiona and others like her can realize their dreams in America, and we in this country can continue our role as a country of boundless opportunity for those looking to build a brighter future. Now, on a recent trip to New Orleans, I met a young woman named Essence Jackson. Now, last year, Essence's daughter, Milani, had attended a public school in New Orleans. And midway through the year, Milani's teacher approached Essence and told her that her daughter just was not getting what she needed, was not getting the quality education that she deserved at that public school, that Milani was frankly too bright, and she needed a different environment in which to thrive. Now, Essence was taken aback a little bit and not really quite understanding all of a sudden this special attention. And Milani's teacher then informed Essence about a special program that had just begun in Louisiana called the Louisiana Scholarship Program. Now, the program, the teacher told Essence, could provide funding that would allow Milani to attend a better school. It would offer Essence the comfort of knowing that Milani could really have that avenue to success, the same kind of success that Fiona at GW is chasing here in America. Milani now attends kindergarten at a Catholic elementary school and participates in Louisiana's scholarship program and is thriving. Essence couldn't be happier for her daughter because Milani is now in a school with caring teachers, with concerned administrators, and a school that offers a safe environment in which to learn. Now, unfortunately, the Louisiana Supreme Court is considering a challenge to that program that has given Essence and Milani a new lease on life. Essence is hoping that the Supreme Court throws out the case and confided in me that, frankly, if they don't, and if this program is struck down, that it will do anything, including dropping out of her own education and going to find 3 jobs just to be able to afford to keep Milani in that school. Now, we in this country have got to fight for kids like Milani. Essence is fighting for Milani. That's what America is about. And so education reform and fixing our schools are no longer an option. We've got to get it done. And we have to fight for people like Essence, just like we have to fight for people like Fiona. Because all they want is simply to get ahead in life and be in a productive and successful lane for the future. So in the House, we're going to be pursuing ways that we can allow education dollars to follow the child and give parents the options of sending their children to public, private, or charter schools, giving parents and students the opportunity to choose a school that's best for them, to give them the best opportunity for future success. Now, America will continue to grow, and we'll continue to make mistakes. But we've got to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of our past. We must embrace our diversity and continually work to make America that more perfect union. Outside my office in the Capitol is a statue of Hannibal Hamlin. Hamlin served as a senator from the state of Maine and was an opponent of the Chinese exclusion laws. He publicly declared that his vote against the 1879 15-passenger bill would be a legacy to his children and hoped that they might deem it the brightest act of his life. Now think about that for a minute. Hamlin was a very accomplished individual. He was an ambassador, he was a member of the House, he was a governor of his state, he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he was Vice President of the United States under Abraham Lincoln. But for all he accomplished, he considered his standing on principle against the Chinese exclusion bill, even though he lost, the brightest act of his life. Perhaps it's not just a coincidence that a man who stood so steadfast for the principles of our founding, for equality, for hope, and opportunity, died like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams before him on Independence Day. Today, it is up to us to pick up the torch and fight to make sure that students like Fiona can pursue their dreams here in America. We must fight so that working moms like Essence Jackson don't have to worry about their children being trapped in failing schools. We've got to all commit ourselves to fight to make life work for the American people so that this country remains a land of opportunity in the future for all. Thank you all at the committee very much for having me. It is an honor to be here with you this morning.
Thank you, Congressman Cantor. We have a number of questions that are coming from the floor, and we do have a question right here from the Committee 100. And so I'll take the liberty to address this question to you. The Committee 100 has taken the position that skills-based family and family-based immigration are compatible goals, though they are presented now as opposed to one another in the current immigration debate. We'd like to know your view on this false dilemma.
We obviously have immigration under review, under consideration in many, many halls of the Capitol, both in the House and the Senate, both in the Republican and Democratic caucuses. These issues of family reunification, of skilled-based visas are front and center to how we get the immigration bill passed. And I would respond to you and say that family reunification, families being able to be here and to earn their success and create their dreams is what America is all about. I talked about the history of my family, and it was the determination of my grandmother to come here to this country for the betterment and future of her sons, so that they could have opportunities that she didn't have in the ancestral homelands. So I believe that this country of ours is a country of opportunity, and if people want to come here to work, to grow, to create their dreams, we've got to get our legal immigration system straight and then ensure that we continue to be a country of laws and continue to have a strong system at our border and local interior enforcement system so that our country can continue to operate with transparency, equal application of the law, and equal opportunity for everyone.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I was informed that amongst our list of questions that were submitted, they were all covered by your very extensive and thorough remarks. So that is all from our very inspiring speaker today. Thank you so much, Congressman.
Thank you very much.